Everybody, welcome back to the Starved Rock Murders. I'm your host, Andy Hale. We've got a little bit of a break until May when we have our evidentiary hearing. So I'm filling in with some podcast episodes about some other issues in the case that we've talked about. And the last two episodes, I've talked about the lack of probable cause to arrest Chester Weger, how that was portrayed in the book, The Starved Rock Murders. Let's continue our book club, shall we? Let's continue our book club talking about The Starved Rock Murders, a true story by Steve Stout. Okay, and I want to talk about the Twine. This episode's going to focus on the Twine, and I'm going to read you part of the book, chapter 6, pages 76 going into 77. Bear with me. Here we go. The state's attorney had never had to play detective in his many years in office, but as it appeared that state police authorities were making little progress, he saw no alternative. Since it was apparent that the crime was sexually motivated, Warren began to read all the investigative material on such criminal acts he could find. Coinciding with his research, the lawyer attended a lecture held in Chicago by Hugh P. McDonald of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department on the analysis of sex crimes. Meeting with McDonald privately, Warren discussed the slim clues of the Starved Rock case and gained what was to be valuable insight into the mystery. The most important insight was that the key to the solution of every crime is located at the scene, and that the slim facts of the Park murders pointed to a local person as the killer. Warren returned to his courthouse office and attacked the riddle with renewed vitality, keeping in mind his conversation with the expert. First, he collected the evidence back from the Michigan lab and took it secretly to his own private law office away from his public facilities. There, he studied the available data and physical objects such as clothing, binoculars, camera, film, and other personal effects found at the scene for hours at a time. He reached into his own pocket for $80 to purchase a simple microscope and examine the cords used to tie the victims together. He found that there were two types of twine used in the fatal assault. One was 20-ply, the other 12-ply. Somehow Warren knew he had to start with these meager details. Okay, that's page 76 and page 77. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but this makes it sound like Harlan Warren figured all this out. That late in the game, after months and months and months of the case being closed, Harlan Warren was the only person who thought, hey, maybe we should look at the Twine. Duh, everybody looked at the Twine within days. This was examined within days. Harlan Warren didn't crack the case by looking at the Twine 6-7 months later with his $80 microscope. No, please. Let's continue the book. We'll turn the page to page 78 and 70. Page 78. Let me just read you then what happens next under the Starved Rock Murders, A True Story by Steve Stout. Here we go. This is talking about Harlan Warren now going to the lodge to see what kind of twine he could find. Without a word, the kitchen helper simply reached up on a nearby shelf and brought down a cardboard box filled with balls of twine. Warren found most of these to be 20-ply, but then found one ball that appeared smaller than the others. Cutting off a piece, he marked the length and placed it with the samples in his pocket. Thanking Spiros for his time, Warren left the lodge and walked to his car in the parking lot. As he sat in his automobile, Warren slowly counted the strands in the last piece of cord collected in the kitchen. If the number in it added up to 12, the case might be well on its way to being solved, Warren thought to himself. The answer came quickly. He counted to 12, overjoyed. The attorney now knew that the murderer most likely had access to the galley area of the Starved Rock facilities. And for the first time, Warren was positive that he would catch the assassin. Deputies Hess and Dummett, following through on the list of supply houses that serviced the Parks Lodge, soon traced the Twine to the manufacturing firm of January and Wood in Maysville, Kentucky. Consulting with one of the plant's executives, the two officers proved through chemical analysis that the 12-ply section of cord found on the women's bodies was originally taken from the roll found in the lodge. That fact simply confirmed that what Warren had already surmised. He was on the proper course. So there you have it. Harlan Warren allegedly cracked the case, and Dummett and Hess did chemical analysis that proved that the twine found on the women, the 12-ply twine, came from the lodge. Wow. What a bombshell, okay? Well, I took a very deep dive into this, and I talked about it much earlier, way back in a podcast episode. Probably most of you don't even remember it. I wrote a whole article about this called The Tale of the Twine. What I'd like to do is read this article to you. It's my rebuttal to what you just saw in the book, The Starved Rock Murders, A True Story. Okay, so let me read it to you. I'll try to go slow and follow with me. But here is my article, A Tale of the Twine. I'll post this on the podcast website too, with all the source documents so you can read it for yourself. I'm pretty sure I've already posted it, but I'll post it again. Okay, here we go. This is something I wrote. One of the greatest fallacies regarding the evidence found in connection to the murders at Starved Rock has been that the twine found at the crime scene was the same twine found in the Starved Rock Lodge's kitchen. There is absolutely no connection between the twine from the crime scene and the twine from the kitchen, and yet, time and time again, that twine has been argued by representatives of the LaSalle County State's Attorney's Office as though it is the linchpin of the case. For example, in the recent HBO docuseries, The Murders at Starved Rock, there's footage of a 2005 interview with former LaSalle County State's Attorney Harlan Warren. During that interview, Mr. Warren claims that he was sitting around his office trying to solve the crime when he absent-mindedly decided to look at the knotted cord that he claimed was around the wrists of the three ladies. I drop a footnote here and I say, Mr. Warren's description is factually incorrect. There was no knotted twine found on the wrists of the three women. The piece of knotted twine was found in the cave near the women's bodies. Okay, so let's continue. Mr. Warren claims that he counted the number of strands and that it came to 32. Mr. Warren then claims that he went to the lodge late at night when no one was around and found a cone of 20-strand twine and a ball of 12-strand twine. And when you add that up, 32 strands. And that's what I just read to you from the book, the Starved Rock Murders book. But there's a problem with Mr. Warren's dramatic story. It is factually untrue. Contemporaneous newspaper accounts report that 20-strand twine was found tied around the wrists of Frances Murphy and Lillian Oding, and that a piece of 20-strand twine was found knotted to a piece of, this is important, 10-strand twine. Let me say that again. 10-strand twine near the mouth of the cave in St. Louis Canyon. And I drop a footnote there to a Chicago Tribune article dated March 21st, 1960. Here it is, right here. And this article talks about there was a 20-strand length tied with a granny knot to a piece of 10-strand twine. 10-strand twine. Okay. These newspaper accounts are corroborated by March 20th, 1960 handwritten notes produced pursuant to a Freedom of Information Act request that indicate that there was 20 strand twine found around the wrists of victim A, which was Miss Murphy, and victim C, Mrs. Oding. Those handwritten notes also state that there was a piece of twine found below victim B, Mrs. Lindquist, that was comprised of two different sizes of twine knotted together, 20 strand and 10 strand. And I drop a footnote, and these are the notes from a meeting of the crime lab on March 20th, just days after the bodies were found. And it talks about 20 strand knotted to 10 strand. So Harlan Warren wasn't the first one to look at the strands of twine 6-7 months later. This had been done within days. And the crime lab analyzed this thoroughly and figured out it was 20 strand and there was a piece knotted with 10 strand. Okay, let me continue. I've got a lot more to say. Got to catch my breath. Okay, here we go. If that were not enough proof, the criminal trial testimony is the nail in the coffin on this issue. There was absolutely zero evidence offered at Chester Weger's trial that there was any 12-strand twine found at the crime scene. In spite of this, Harlan Warren would continue to claim in the years and decades following the trial that the twine clinched the case. Again, no evidence of 12-strand twine was introduced at trial. If there was actually 12-strand twine found at the crime scene, surely the state would have introduced that twine into evidence. It did not, as there was no 12-strand twine. The false narrative of the twine lived on in the countless retellings of the case by Harlan Warren and others until it started to become gospel. In reality, the only evidence the state offered regarding twine was that Mrs. Oding was found with 20-strand twine tied around her wrist. However, there was no evidence or testimony connecting this 20-strand twine to the Starved Rock Lodge. Glenn Kamati, the chef at the Starved Rock Lodge, testified that he would order 20-strand and 12-strand twine for use in the kitchen. Mr. Kamati was allowed to testify on his direct examination over a strenuous and proper defense objection that he had seen twine, quote, similar to the 20-strand twine found around Miss Oding's wrist in the kitchen at the Starved Rock Lodge. On cross-examination, Mr. Kamati admitted that he could not personally say that the 20-strand twine found on Mrs. Oding's wrist came from the kitchen at the lodge. He further admitted that the 20-strand twine found around Mrs. Oding's wrist was a very common type of twine and could be purchased from several sources. The state also called Edward Werhand as a witness. Mr. Werhand testified that he was the office manager of B.A. Railton Company, a wholesale grocer in Chicago. Mr. Werhand testified that in September 1959, his company had received an order for 20-strand twine from Nick Sparrows at the Starved Rock Lodge. Mr. Werhand testified that his company purchased the 20-strand twine from the J.L. Dugan Company in Chicago. On cross-examination, Attorney McNamara asked Mr. Werhand, quote, "And is there anything particularly unusual about this particular 20-pound twine?" To which Mr. Werhand responded, "No, sir." Finally, the state also called James Dugan as a witness. Mr. Dugan testified that in January of 1959, his company, J.L. Dugan, shipped about 200 pounds of 20-strand twine to the B.A. Railton Company where Mr. Werhand worked. Mr. Dugan further testified that this 20-strand twine was manufactured by the January and Wood Company in Maysville, Kentucky. On cross-examination, Mr. Dugan testified that his company sells twine to wholesalers, including industrial accounts like Sears Roebuck. That was the extent of Mr. Dugan's testimony. The state did not offer any witness from the January and Wood Company in Maysville, Kentucky. Let's continue. Let me catch my breath. The only other mention of 12-strand twine at the trial came from Assistant State's Attorney Craig Armstrong, who testified that he went to Chester Weger's house looking for 12-strand twine, but only found 12-strand twine, which Chester Weger told him belonged to his uncle. Again, there was no claim by Assistant State's Attorney Armstrong or any other witness that 12-strand twine had been found at the crime scene. This extremely weak trial testimony regarding the 20-strand twine and Attorney McNamara's effective cross-examination of these witnesses must have caused the state to abandon making any claim that the 20-strand twine found around Mrs. Oding came from the lodge. It's all Mr. Richardson could muster during his closing argument on this issue was the following, quote, "So they went into the cave or by the cave on the rock, sat there and allowed themselves to be tied. With what? With string. With what kind of string? 20-ply cord. This man has a propensity for carrying string in his pockets. That has been brought out in this case." End of quote. Thus, the state abandoned any argument that the 20-strand twine found around the wrist of Mrs. Oding was the same type of twine used at the Starved Rock Lodge, and instead weakly argued that Chester Weger had a propensity for carrying twine in his pocket. Hardly a persuasive argument. Mr. McNamara, in his closing argument, however, made it a point to argue to the jury how the state had not connected the 20-strand twine at the crime scene to Chester Weger, stating, quote, and I'm going to read this verbatim. Now let's picture Mr. McNamara saying this too. Picture this at trial. Now let's go to the string. Now this string, which was identified as being on the wrist of Mrs. Oding, the victim in this case, can be dismissed as being a common 20-ply butcher twine, which is common throughout the entire world and has not been tied into this case or in with the defendant in any way, aside from his confessions, which he has denied as being completely involuntary and is partially told to him by Deputy William Dummett. In fact, as will be shown later on when his home was completely searched, you will recall the only kind of string that was found was 12-ply string, and that this type of string has no connection with this case or has been tied in with the defendant in any way. Now, referring again to the string, there is no testimony that the string that was on the wrist of Mrs. Oding is the same string that is contained in the lodge. The only testimony you have is that it looks similar, and there is no effort made. There was no effort made by the prosecution to examine the same or to set down the time when any sample might have been obtained. And the only evidence before you is that the string at the lodge is purchased from, is manufactured by a company in Kentucky, who sells it to a company in Chicago, who sells it to the lodge. I say that it is completely immaterial. Further than that the string on the lady's wrist is not identified as being the same string that is obtainable in the lodge. This string has not been tied in with the defendant in any way. There has been much testimony about it, but it has not been tied in with the defendant in any way. That was Chester's attorney McNamara's closing argument on the Twine. In the state's rebuttal closing argument, Assistant Attorney Anthony Reculia, who had just heard Mr. McNamara's argument to the jury as to the Twine, elected not to discuss the Twine at all. Okay, I'm not done. I've got some more to go. In fact, I got to take a drink of water, right? There's just so much to say here. Let's continue with my tale of the Twine. But we're not yet done with our tale of the Twine. There are a few more tall tales that need to be discussed. In reviewing my files, I recently came across a July 23rd, 2004 editorial written in the Daily Times, Ottawa, Illinois, by former Assistant State's Attorney Peter F. Ferracuti, titled, "No Doubt That Uyghur is Guilty," end of quote. In this editorial, Mr. Ferracuti states that at the time of the murders, he was assigned to prosecute major criminal cases involving the LaSalle County State's Attorney's Office, and that he remains, quote, "firmly convinced that Chester Uyghur did commit the unspeakable crimes in the deaths of the three women at Starved Rock State Park in March 1960, end of quote." Mr. Ferracuti further states that, quote, "unquestionably, State's Attorney Harlan Warren and two LaSalle County Sheriff's Department deputies, the late William Dummett and the late Wayne Hess, by their persistence together, solved this crime where the FBI, the state police, and the FBI had failed," end of quote. What a fucking joke. Let me continue. In support of this claim, Mr. Ferracuti offers a stunning argument, one I had never heard before. Quote, "I recall Harlan, in an analytical way, observing that there was actually only one piece of evidence foreign to the crime scene, obviously brought there by the murderer, that being the beige butcher's twine used to bind the women's wrists with nautical knots. This became the primary focus on their investigation. To the naked eye, the twine appeared to be the kind used practically everywhere, but under microscope, the twine had embedded color fragments of other dyed twine, otherwise not visible. The inquiry now was to determine who manufactured such colored twine. We ultimately found a plant in Kentucky, and one of the customers was in fact Starved Rock Lodge, where the same butcher's twine was used in the dining room kitchen. The investigation turned towards kitchen employees, one of whom was Chester Uyghur," end of quote. Okay, I've already explained to you how none of that came up at trial. Not one shred of that. No proof of that whatsoever. And do you not think if the state had proof of this chemical analysis and the twine found in Mrs. Oding could be matched chemically to the lodge, they wouldn't have put that on through expert testimony? Really? Give me a fucking break. Let me continue. However, the state did not offer any evidence at Chester Uyghur's criminal trial regarding these alleged, quote, "color fragment," end of quote, characteristics of the twine. The state offered no expert testimony from anyone seeking to compare the twine found around Mrs. Oding's wrist to the twine used in the lodge. Instead, as discussed above, the state merely called Len Kamadi to testify that he ordered the twine from the lodge, Mr. Werhan to testify that he supplied twine to the lodge and that he received from J.L. Dugan and Company in Chicago, and Mr. Dugan to testify that he received this twine from the January Wood Company in Maysville, Kentucky. None of this testimony could connect the 20-strand twine found at the crime scene to the lodge, and none of this testimony did anything to disprove that the 20-strand twine found at the crime scene was anything other than ordinary and common 20-strand twine. At the end of the day, the state essentially conceded that the 20-strand twine found around Miss Oding's wrist was common twine, and no connection could be made to the Starved Rock Lodge. The state also made no claim that the 12-strand twine was involved in the crime, as it was not. And most importantly, the state made no mention of the 10-strand twine found in the cave. Let me say that again. The state made no mention of the 10-strand twine found in the cave. Our tale of the twine ends with a discussion of the twine from the book The Starved Rock Murders, an alleged true story by Steve Stout. In that book, the author claims that State's Attorney Harlan Warren, using a microscope that he had purchased for $80, examined the cords used to tie the victims together and found that there were two types of twine used in the fatal assault. One was 20-ply, the other 12-ply. As discussed above, this is blatantly false. Again, there was no evidence no evidence that any 12-ply twine was found at the crime scene. Now, we saved the largest tale for last. In the Starved Rock murders, the author claims that LaSalle County Sheriff's deputies Dummett and Hess consulted with an executive at January and Wood in Maysville, Kentucky, and that, quote, the two officers proved through chemical analysis that the 12-ply section of cord found on the women's bodies was originally taken from the roll in the lodge. The author claims that this bombshell discovery by deputies Dummett and Hess caused Harlan Warren to focus on Starved Rock Lodge kitchen employees, which soon turned the investigation towards Chester Weger. Despite allegedly making this stunning forensic discovery, neither Deputy Dummett nor Deputy Hess nor anyone else testified about any chemical analysis of the twine at Chester Weger's criminal trial. Why didn't they testify at the trial about the alleged chemical analysis of the twine? Again, and for the final time, they never testified because there was no evidence that there was any 12-ply twine found on the victims, let alone 12-ply twine that had been proven through chemical analysis or in any other manner to have been taken from a roll of twine used in the Starved Rock Lodge. This is simply another tall tale that has been passed on over the years. One has to ask, why? Why? Why has the twine evidence been so misrepresented? Is it simply an innocent mistake? Did Harlan Warren really think there was 12-ply twine found at the crime scene? If so, did he not realize once the trial took place that he was mistaken? Did deputies Dummett and Hess simply forget to tell the state of their stunning forensic analysis that proved this mysterious 12-ply twine recovered at the crime scene had been taken from a roll of twine at the Starved Rock Lodge? Or was this all part of a plan to perpetuate the myth that Chester Weger was the person responsible for the brutal killing of 3 women at the Starved Rock Lodge on March 14th, 1960? That is my dramatic reading of my Tale of the Twine. Let that all sink in, ladies and gentlemen. Let that all sink in. And I also wanted to give, I forgot to give at the start, a special shout out to the Will County State's Attorney's Office, who I know listen to this podcast. They're avid listeners. I welcome Will County as well. Let that sink in, how it has been so misrepresented over the year, the twine evidence. Let all that sink in, how that happened and why it happened. But let me say for the final time, there was no link, none, made at the criminal trial between the twine found at the crime scene and the Starved Rock Lodge. None, zip, zada, nada, zero, nothing, nothing. Unbelievable. It's such an incredible misrepresentation. It's so upsetting to go through and read that again and see how that's been portrayed. But that's what it is. I will be back with some more updates between now and May. We've got, maybe we'll continue our book club talking about the Starved Rock murders. Maybe we'll talk about some other things. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will post my Tale of the Twine document and all my source documents on the Andy Hale podcast website. You can read it all for yourselves. I encourage you to do so. And for everybody out there, thank you again on behalf of Chester and his family. Thank you so much for your love and support. It means so much of us. We all really appreciate it. We're looking forward to the May evidentiary hearing. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.